Okay, welcome back to part 2 of making the writing system. So the goal for today is to get as much of the actual system itself worked out as possible, so that next time we can actually get around to making the glyphs. Now, I don't know exactly when I'm going to have the chance to edit and post this video. Hopefully before the end of November, because in December, I'll just go ahead and announce it here, I will be participating in a special Lexember collaboration. So basically, Madeline James, David and Jesse Peterson, Jake and Miles from Let's Have a Boober, George Corley from Conlanging, and myself have worked together to create a list of prompts for Lexember that will span the whole month. And every day in December we will each be posting a video going over the word that we've coined for that day's prompt. So keep an eye out for that. I will be posting my videos on the main channel, and I'll be breaking yet another promise I made to myself because I will be posting them as shorts, which I've never done before, so we'll see how that goes. And you are also encouraged to follow along and coin some words of your own. So look forward to that, but for now, let's see how much of this writing system we can actually get done. So thank you, as always, to the patrons, and back to work we go. So as you can see, I've gone ahead and compiled this table of all the glyphs we're going to need, and I've filled in the words that we already have that just lend themselves very well to being turned into glyphs. And for the rest of them, I've just roughed in these forms that I came up with more or less at random, just in a way that made sure that we had every possible initial and every possible final covered. And I also came up with a list of potential meanings for glyphs, just based on what things would be easiest to make pictures out of. But I decided not to assign any meanings to these new forms until we actually get to the glyph making process, because I don't want to risk making a glyph that I really like the look of, only for it to be attached to a sound that doesn't exist in the modern language anymore and has been made obsolete. I also still haven't decided if I want to treat coda W and coda Y as finals, or just represent them as sequences with oo and e, because that would save us from having to come up with these 4 separate glyphs. And I've also roughed in, if you recall my idea from last time, that the proto-lang actually allowed word initial S stop and S nasal clusters, so we could end up with some biliteral characters in the script. But the more I think about it, the more contrived I think that is, because it does mean we'll be altering the phonotactics of the proto-lang at this very late stage in the language. And honestly, I'm not sure how much sense it makes for the proto-lang to allow clusters with S word initially, but nowhere else. I feel like I've seen that somewhere before, but I can't think where. And also it means that we would need to make 18 additional glyphs, which might be more trouble than it's worth. So I'm probably not going to do that, but I'll leave them in for now, just in case I change my mind. Now, I got a lot of really great comments on the last episode. They gave me a lot of food for thought. Like one commenter by the name of Lot of Malarkey enlightened me to the existence of the Pahwamong script, which I was not aware of previously, and it's a really fascinating script. And it's a fairly similar idea to what I'm envisioning for this script, so we do have some natural precedence on our side. And reading through what various people were suggesting in the comments, it occurred to me that with the way that this system starts out, we can take it in 2 totally completely directions depending on how vowels are marked. Because what I think I proposed last time is that the vowel characters would be finals. So like for this word ba, you could use that for the initial B, or you could mark it with a diacritic to mean rhymes with ah, so you could use that for the ah vowel. But if that is the case, then that means that pretty much every single syllable will necessarily have an initial followed by a final, right? So pretty much every word will follow the pattern of initial, final, initial, final, initial, final. And so theoretically, you wouldn't even really need a diacritic to mark the finals, because you just know that every odd-numbered glyph is an initial and every even-numbered glyph is a final. The exception, of course, being syllables that don't have an onset, like if a word is vowel initial or something. So maybe instead there's a diacritic specifically to mark that. Or maybe not a diacritic, maybe just a separate glyph for a null onset. which we could do what the Semitic languages do and just use the character for the glottal stop, because that disappears pretty early on in history. And so if we did that, then literally every single word would just be initial, final, etc. But then later on, when vowel loss happens, and we get a bunch of new codas, that's when we'll probably have to introduce some sort of diacritic to mark an initial as being actually a final, just as a way of saying this sound doesn't actually have a vowel after it. Now, although that idea is kind of interesting, I get the feeling that if there is just this consistent pattern of initial, final, then over time they would be sorted into syllable blocks or become ligatures or something along those lines so that they would end up ultimately becoming just syllable characters. And at that point we've basically just reinvented the Nakashti script, which is definitely something I don't want to do. So the alternative is to say that vowels are treated as initials rather than finals. So you would only use the final characters and the diacritic that marks them when there is actually a coda consonant there, which will be common, but not hugely common. It's not like you're going to have to mark this on every single syllable. And some people brought up the question of instrument and medium, because certain mediums might influence the way the system works. Like in a lot of scripts that are written with ink, scribes often find ways of abbreviating things, or they invent diacritics to prevent them from needing to write out superfluous letters. And I was going to save the discussion of instrument and medium for when we actually get to making the glyphs, but what I'm thinking at the moment is that the original script would either have been carved into stone or pressed into clay or wax tablets. But later on in history it would have been adapted to be used with ink. So that is something to consider as we go forward with this. And I also had another epiphany. Honestly, I don't know why I didn't think of this sooner. If you remember last time, I was worrying how we were going to handle the loss of so many consonant distinctions from the proto-lang, because more than half of the consonants from the proto-lang get lost over the course of history, and we're going to end up with loads of different ways of writing the same sound. And it occurred to me that Thai also has an abundance of ways to write every consonant. Like, I think there's like 5 or 6 different ways to write the voiceless stops. But of course, the reason for that is, like a lot of other Southeast Asian and Indic languages, these extra characters are preserved because of their use in writing Sanskrit, because the scribes wanted a way of preserving the original spelling of Sanskrit loanwords. And it occurred to me that Takvamir could have a broadly similar relationship with Project Hermes, because Project Hermes is supposed to be this prestige language of science and learning and progress, etc. And I imagine there will be a fair few loanwords from Project Hermes into Takvamir, especially words to do with technology and alchemy and things like that. And from the very little work that I've done on Project Hermes so far, I'm fairly certain that it's going to have a much, much larger consonant inventory than Takvamir. And as I have it at the moment, it is going to have adjectives, and it's probably also going to have a palatal series. And so if we say that the glyphs for the adjectives and the palatals are kept around just for writing Project Hermes, then that alone takes care of a huge number of the superfluous glyphs we have. And plus we might be able to use some of the other sounds, like the voiced uvula for example, in writing any other sounds that Project Hermes might have that Takvamir doesn't have an obvious equivalent for. So that actually solves that problem quite nicely, I think. So that goes a long way in sorting out the consonants, but for the vowels we have the opposite problem, because the proto-lang only has 3 vowels and the modern language has 6 vowels. So if we go with the idea that vowels are treated as initials, then that means that the proto-lang will have glyphs for a, e, and u. But very early on in the language's history, we do have allophonic vowel lowering following uvulas, pharyngeals, and ejectives, and the mid-vowels become phonemic once the voiced uvula stop and the voiced pharyngeal fricative are lost. So one way that mid-vowels could be written is if we use the glyph for one of the sounds that is causing vowel lowering before it's lost. Like just say the voiced pharyngeal, and you just know that the following vowel has to be a mid-vowel. And then later on the 2 glyphs could either fuse together into a ligature, or the character for the pharyngeal could become a diacritic of some kind. Just to save ink and space, the scribes could just write a little mini version of the pharyngeal glyph above the vowel character, and then just over time it could just simplify into just a little diacritic. And of course we have to keep in mind that this diacritic would also be applied to finals, because if you had a syllable like M, then you would use the final glyph for the rhyme im, and then use this same pharyngeal glyph, which makes me favour the diacritic option as opposed to the ligature, because making ligatures for every final for e and u just sounds like a lot of extra work. So then for e and so these vowels come about by two different means. One is from the coalescing of these vowels in hiatus, and the other is following a palatal. So if we went with the first option, it could just be as simple as you just write it as like a UI sequence, or IU. Or if we do decide to include W and Y in the finals, then these two finals, U and UI, both end up going to E. So we kind of get that one for free. So if we go with these vowel sequences, then we can just say that the separate vowel characters merge together, or we can do another diacritic. Whereas for the finals U and UI, we just get a single glyph for free. And then for we can just put the pharyngeal on it to mark that the vowel has been lowered. Which means that if we go with the vowel hiatus option, that means that this character will potentially have two different diacritics. Or if the U and the E merge together, they can sort of share one diacritic. Whereas if we go with the finals option, there'll also be two diacritics, one for the vowel lowering and the other because these are finals. So either way, this is going to be quite a busy glyph. Now, when it comes to the palatals, that would remove the need for a diacritic, because you just know automatically that a vowel following a palatal consonant must be fronted. And then after the palatal distinction is lost, essentially you would end up with two different glyphs for each of the characters in the alveolar series, one when the following vowel is fronted and one when it's not. So that's another potential reason to keep the palatals around, but of course you would still need a way to mark a fronted vowel if it's following a consonant that's not a palatal. Like if you had a sequence like ne, for example. So it could be that this diacritic strategy is only used when the preceding glyph is not a palatal. Reminds me a bit of the situation in Spanish, where the k consonant in front of most vowels is just written with a C. So ka, ko, and ku are written just as you'd expect. But because of palatalization, what used to be ke and ki are now pronounced se and si. And so if you want to write ke and ki, you have to use qu. So there's this kind of asymmetry in the way you write this sound. And so in a kind of similar way for these vowels, ordinarily all you'd have to do to represent them is use these glyphs, but precede it with the palatal variant of the consonant glyph. But if there is no palatal variant of the consonant glyph, then you have to use some special diacritic to mark it. Or, alternatively, we could just say at some point they implement a spelling reform, and just for the sake of uniformity, they pick this strategy, and they just say anytime you have an E or an it has to be written like this, regardless of what the preceding consonant is. And maybe one motivation for that is that they want to preserve the characters for the palatal sounds for writing Project Hermes, so that those glyphs only occur in loanwords. I don't know, I can see pros and cons of both of those ideas. And of course, the third place that we get these vowels from is through umlaut. If there's a final or stressed high vowel, then that turns a preceding u and o into e and which, at least to my mind, kind of reinforces the diacritic idea, because I think scribes are much more likely to just put a little dot over something to indicate that the quality has changed, rather than completely swap out the vowel character. So if we do have some little diacritic that just means fronting, I think that will lend itself quite well to that. Or indeed to change the preceding consonant glyph to its palatal variant. So I don't know, I'm kind of on the fence. I might have to come back to that. And while it occurs to me, the other thing to consider is when U and E centralize and merge to the schwa, do they just keep both glyphs, and you just have to know that they both make the same sound? Or is one preferred in some environments and the other preferred in others? Well, there is some utility in keeping them separate, because when it comes to vowel harmony, one variant is treated as a high vowel and the other as a low vowel. And U and E did merge relatively recently in history, so I think we're justified in saying that they maintain the two different glyphs, because you get multiple different glyphs for the same sound in loads of different systems. But then there's the issue of vowel length, because I think we're safe in saying that in the proto-script there was no real way to write long vowels, you just duplicated the glyph for the vowel. But that seems to me to be a prime candidate for something that the scribes would invent a shortcut for. You know, instead of having to write out the same character twice, you use some kind of diacritic. And the same thing goes for geminates as well. Like, I'm pretty sure that's where the tilde comes from. It was originally a way of just shortening up a geminate N, I think. So, we could say that there is a specific diacritic that comes along to mark long vowels, but if that's the case, if we stick with what we have here, then a long vowel could potentially have 3 diacritics on it simultaneously, which I think is a bit of a tall order. Alternatively, we could use a glyph for one of the weak consonants that disappears and causes compensatory lengthening. Probably shouldn't use the glyph for the pharyngeal, because we're already using that for vowel lowering, but an H seems like a fine candidate. Now, there is no final for H in the proto-lang, because obstruents can't come in coda position. But that's fine, because all we have to do is say that if you see an initial H character in front of another consonant, then you know that the preceding vowel is long. Whereas if you see the initial H after a consonant, then you know that the preceding consonant is geminated. That's exactly what I did in Okalawak, but it works. So proto-H gives us an iteration mark, and again, that does seem like the kind of thing that could become a diacritic if we want it to, but again, I'm concerned about kind of overloading this character. If we say that the pharyngeal becomes a diacritic for vowel lowering, and the E vowel becomes a diacritic for vowel fronting, then maybe for the vowel, the fronting diacritic and the lowering diacritic could merge together into one diacritic ligature? So then, what was the proto-U glyph will have 3 different possible diacritics. One for when it's lowered, one for when it's fronted, and one for when it's lowered and fronted. Whereas if we say that the pharyngeal merges with the E and the U to produce ligatures, rather than diacritics, then we end up with a situation that's annoyingly similar to the Latin alphabet, where essentially you have a basic glyph for A, E, O, and U, whereas E and are marked with diacritics. Let me actually think about palatals for a moment, because in the proto-lang we've got this great big palatal series, but what do they actually correspond to in the modern language? So some of these are pretty straightforward, like the palatal nasal just becomes an N everywhere, and the voice palatal fricative becomes R everywhere, but a lot of these might actually be too unstable to reliably mark vowel fronting. Like, the palatal stop is kind of all over the place, and even though you can largely predict what variant is going to surface, it feels like the kind of thing that would be weeded out by spelling reforms. And plus you've got the palatal ejective, which surfaces in exactly the same way, except it also causes the following vowel to lower, which, I mean, I guess we could do the same thing with the low vowels as we do with the front vowels, and say that certain consonants have low vowel variants that you need to know, but at that point we're just getting really deep into historical spelling, and we're essentially leaving the proto-consonant inventory perfectly intact, and I don't think I want to go that far. I kind of want the system to have been updated periodically throughout history. So even though I do kind of like the idea of having palatal variants of certain glyphs, I think I'm now leaning towards keeping the palatal glyphs around only for transcribing Project Hermes. And in fact, while we're at it, let me just check something. Yeah, I actually forgot about this, but rotization is a very recent sound change. So I think it's fairly likely that they might still keep around a glyph for Z. So before rotization happens, these would be the correspondences for the palatals. So in the modern language, we're definitely going to have a R, and the script has not been updated since rotization happened, so that means that the R glyph will only be used in places where there was an actual proto-R as well. And there's obviously going to be a glyph for S as well, which at the very least will come from proto-S, but there are all these other sounds that also give rise to S. So it's just a question of whether or not we actually want to keep the palatals around. Whereas, since this is before rotization, then there will also be a separate glyph for Z, even though in the modern language Z is always pronounced R. And also, another thing to consider is that because of metathesis, a lot of these sibilants and liquids will no longer be occurring before a vowel, because if they're in a cluster with another consonant, when metathesis happens they are no longer in coda position, so they won't come immediately before the vowel that they are fronting. So that's another thing that makes them kind of less useful as a way of indicating fronting. So yeah, I'm leaning more and more towards the palatals falling out of use in the modern language. You know what, let's actually do this properly. You know what, I've actually just realized I've had this word wrong the whole time. Because in the Proto-Lang, S is palatal before an I, so it should be sin. Wow, so that means we're going to need another glyph for the S. But ignoring that for the time being, I also realize now that obviously not every character that has a palatal initial is going to have a palatal final. So that means, like, for this glyph, for example, which in the Proto-Lang was nim, in the modern Lang, if they get rid of the palatal characters, then this glyph will never be used as an initial, but it will be used as a final. So that means we end up with some finals that don't have a corresponding initial. So in other words, we will have some glyphs that just always have a diacritic, and they have no corresponding initial that doesn't have a diacritic. Feels a touch strange, but I think it's doable. And I suppose one thing that would help that feel a little bit more natural is if we say that the diacritic is not actually a diacritic. Like, it could start out as a diacritic, but then as the script changes medium, it just sort of becomes incorporated into the character. Like, the scribes try and write the diacritic and the glyph in the same stroke, so what was a diacritic ends up becoming just like an ascender or descender or something. Although I do want to make the glyphs for the initial and final be recognizably similar to each other, so you can tell that the final is formed from just a very simple modification of the initial, but we can work with that, I think. So if the final diacritic isn't particularly intrusive, then I guess the simplest option for writing the y and would be to have them come from these finals here, but that will mean that y and work differently than all the other vowels, because all the other vowels are treated as initials and are therefore expected to have finals come after them, whereas y and would always be final. And if there was a coda consonant afterwards, it would have to be written with an initial, which feels really incongruent with the way the rest of the system works. But then, of course, we have to remember that the fronting and lowering diacritics have to be compatible with the final diacritic anyway, because they're not just being marked on the independent vowel characters, they're also being marked on the finals. And again, the idea of making separate ligatures for every single possible final is kind of daunting, so it might just be easiest to keep them as separate diacritics. And then we come back to the fact that the only thing that concerns me is this character for which for any final with an vowel, you're going to have 3 different diacritics on it. And if it's a long in a closed syllable, then 4 different diacritics. And if we're not careful, it'll end up like Vietnamese, diacritics all over the place. But then again, we could make the diacritics merge in some way, so there's probably a way to make it work. I guess we'll just have to see how things go once we get to the stage of actually making the glyphs, and we'll just try our best to make them fit together in whatever way we can. But if we just go with that for the time being, we've got all of the consonants in the modern language covered. The only thing left to really consider is just historical spelling. Ah yes, I forgot to mention, we're only getting V quite recently in history, and it comes from either a fortified W at the beginning of words and following an obstruent, or from an intervocalic B. And I think that this is recent enough in history and clearly predictable enough that we don't need a separate character for V. You just know the environments that a W turns into a V, and they still use the same glyph for the B when it's between vowels. Now, when it comes to this epenthesis that breaks up word final clusters, that's also happened very recently in history. So I'm inclined to say that the spelling hasn't caught up with it yet. So there are lots of words that are still written with a word final cluster, but you just sort of have to know that there's actually a vowel in there. So like what's written as, say, ast, you just have to know that it's actually pronounced arat. Or maybe we could say it's at an intermediate stage, like maybe you do have to write that epenthetic vowel, but you just have to know that the S is pronounced as a trill there. I might change my mind, but I think I actually like this middle option the best. And if the spelling system hasn't caught up to rhoticization, then it's definitely not caught up with liquid dissimilation. So there's going to be loads of R's all over the place that you just sort of know that you have to pronounce as L's. And this thing where a W following an M or a B causes gemination, I think that's the kind of thing where there could still be some old-fashioned spellings maintained into the modern language that preserve that W, but in most instances are now just written as a geminate. It's just occurred to me that there's actually two different ways that geminates could be written. Because in the Proto-Lang, if we had a word like akaha, and then with vowel loss it would become akha, which would later become akka, so the way that would be written in the proto-system would be an A initial, K initial, another A initial, an H initial, and another A initial. And when that middle A and the H disappears, and what used to be the H glyph becomes a ligature/diacritic to mark gemination, then in the modern language it will be written initial A, and then initial K with an iteration mark, and then initial A. But if you had another word in the Proto-Lang like arha, and then when the H drops out that geminates the R, but in the proto-system that would be written with the AR final, then the H initial, and then the A. So if we maintain that same logic into the modern language, then it would be the AR final with an iteration mark, and then the A. So basically the question is, does the iteration mark for geminates go on initials or finals, or both? Because obviously since there are only finals for coda resonance, then geminating a final could only ever give you a geminate resonant. I feel like over time they will settle on consistently marking the initial. I think it's just easier to interpret that way. And again, all the finals already have a diacritic on them. The last thing we need to do is add another diacritic. So geminates are always marked on the initial, and really the last thing I can think to do for the moment is whether or not to keep these finals with Y and W. Because U and Ui both turn into I, but again, unlike the sort of core vowel characters, they would be treated as finals, which is kind of weird. Maybe, I don't know how much I like this idea, but maybe they could be kept around for writing word final vowels, just as a stylistic kind of thing. And it also might come in handy if the proto-system doesn't have spaces between words, so it would act as a way of saying that one word has ended and the next word is beginning. And we could do the same thing with the core vowels as well. We could say they act as finals only when they're in the final syllable of a word, which is kind of interesting, but I don't know if it's interesting enough to warrant the extra work. I don't know, I'll have to think about that. But assuming that we don't go with that, then these characters for Iu and Ui will become superfluous, and so they could just be abandoned, or again, maybe they're kept around just to write those sequences in Project Hermes. Whereas Ao and I usually come out looking the same in the modern language. Occasionally they come out as long O and long E, respectively, but not especially often. So it basically just comes down to, do we want to write Ao and I sequences with a single character or with digraphs? I think I do like the idea of having single characters for them, but it occurs to me that we won't have single characters for any other vowel glide sequence. No oi or ei or I or anything else like that. If we go with single characters, then there might be some situations where vowel harmony leads to really weird spelling conventions. Like I'm thinking for this associative causative prefix, if the stem has low unrounded vowels, then the prefix comes out as hai, and so I would be spelled with a single character. But if the stem contains low rounded vowels, then it would come out as hoi, and the oi would need to be spelled with 2 characters. That's not that strange, but I don't know if I like it or not. It might be that in some places it's been regularized, like maybe specifically in this prefix, for example, it has to be written with 2 characters, whereas within roots, or just in older words, it's spelled with a single character. Yeah, I think maybe it might make the system feel a little bit more interesting and naturalistic if we say that there are multiple different ways to spell the same thing. So I think I might end up keeping those in at least some instances. So I've still got a few decisions to make here and there, but by and large, I think we've got the bulk of the system worked out. I'll let you know next time what decisions I've ended up going with and if I've had any further thoughts or epiphanies. But other than that, I think we are just about ready to start making some glyphs. So I will see you all next time for that. I'm not exactly sure when I'll be able to record another episode, hopefully at some point in December, but we will see how it goes. Do let me know if you have any thoughts or ideas in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in Lexember.